I've always liked old houses. There's something about their creaky floors and dusty attics that makes me feel like I'm living in a place with history, a place that's seen things, experienced life. So, when I bought this house, an old two-story place on the outskirts of town, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. The kind of house where you could just feel the stories in the walls. At first, it seemed charming, but now, looking back, I wish I had just walked away. It all started with the basement. Well, not the basement exactly, but what was inside it. I remember the day I first went down there. It was musty, like you'd expect from an old basement, with that earthy, damp smell of concrete and dust. The single bulb dangling from the ceiling barely lit up the space, casting long shadows against the stacked boxes and cobwebbed shelves. There, in the far corner, was an old rocking chair. It was worn, like it had seen years of use. The paint was peeling off, and the wood was darkened from age and who knows what else. Something about it caught my eye immediately. It wasn't just that it was out of place, tucked away in a corner like it had been forgotten. No, it was more than that. It was the way it seemed to own the space, the way my eyes kept drifting back to it, like it demanded my attention. I remember standing there, just staring at it for a few minutes, feeling uneasy. It sounds stupid now, but I could almost feel something coming off that chair, like it had a presence of its own. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. But even as I turned to leave, I found myself glancing back at it, just to make sure it was still where it had been. The next few days went by uneventfully. I worked, unpacked boxes, got used to the house, but something about the basement kept nagging at me. Every time I passed by the door, I felt this slight pull, an urge to go back down, to check on that chair. It made no sense, and I hated that it was getting under my skin like that. I kept telling myself it was just an old piece of furniture, nothing more. One night, though, everything changed. It must have been around 1 or 2 in the morning. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard a noise. It wasn't a loud crash or anything like that, more like a soft creaking sound. I ignored it at first, thinking it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside. But it kept going, rhythmic and steady, like the sound of wood slowly groaning. It didn't take long for me to realize it was coming from the basement. A chill ran down my spine, and I sat up, listening. There it was. Creak, creak, creak. It was unmistakable now, the sound of that rocking chair moving back and forth. I tried to brush it off, tried to convince myself it had to be something else, maybe a draft or a loose floorboard, but my gut told me different. I knew deep down that it was the chair. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer next to my bed, took a deep breath, and made my way downstairs. The whole house felt colder than usual, and my bare feet seemed to stick to the wooden floor as I moved towards the basement door. I remember pausing for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, just listening. The creaking had stopped. The silence that followed was thick, pressing against my ears, almost louder than the sound had been. I opened the door slowly, the hinges squealing as it swung open and flicked on the basement light. The bulb flickered for a moment before coming to life, casting that same dim glow across the space. I stepped down, one stair at a time, the flashlight beam bouncing off the walls, and as I reached the bottom, I turned to where the rocking chair was. It was moving. Not wildly, not violently, just a slow, gentle rocking back and forth. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. There was no breeze, no open window, nothing that could explain why it was moving. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the chair, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I don't know what I was waiting for. Maybe for it to stop, maybe for something to happen. I took a step forward, and as if it heard me, the chair suddenly stopped, the wood groaning one last time before settling into stillness. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I forced myself to take another step closer. That's when I noticed it, a smell. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. A scent of old perfume, floral and powdery, the kind my grandmother used to wear. It shouldn't have been there. The smell was out of place, wrong somehow, and it filled me with a dread I couldn't explain. I reached out, my fingers brushing the arm of the chair, and immediately the scent disappeared. It was like it had never been there at all. I pulled my hand back quickly, stumbling away from the chair and nearly tripping over my own feet as I backed up the stairs. I slammed the basement door shut behind me, my heart still racing. I tried to forget about it. I told myself I must have been imagining things, that I was half asleep and my mind was playing tricks on me. I wanted so badly to believe that. But things only got worse from there. A few nights later, I was watching TV in the living room. It was late, and the only light in the room was the soft glow from the screen. I remember feeling uneasy, like someone was watching me. I kept glancing towards the hallway that led to the basement door, half expecting to see something. I didn't even know what. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling wouldn't leave. I must have dozed off at some point, because when I opened my eyes, the TV was off, and the house was dark. I blinked, disoriented, trying to figure out what had woken me up. That's when I saw her. There, at the edge of the hallway, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure, a woman. She was sitting in the rocking chair, her form faint, almost translucent, but unmistakable. She was old, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, her hands resting on her lap. Her eyes were fixed on me, dark and hollow, and I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. I blinked, and she was gone. The hallway was empty, the basement door closed. I sat there, my body frozen, my mind racing. I knew what I had seen. She was real. I could still feel her gaze on me, the cold lingering in the air. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those empty eyes staring right through me. The next day, I started asking questions. I called the realtor, asked about the previous owners, tried to find out anything I could about the house. It took a few calls, but eventually I got some answers. The house had belonged to an older couple, the kind that had lived there for decades. The husband had passed away years ago, and the wife, she'd died in the house, in the basement. Apparently, she'd spent most of her later years down there, sitting in that rocking chair, refusing to leave even as her health declined. The neighbors said she used to sit there for hours, just rocking back and forth, staring at the walls. I felt a chill run through me as I listened, the pieces clicking into place. The perfume, the rocking chair, the figure in the hallway, it was her. She hadn't left. She was still there, still sitting in her chair, still watching. I knew I couldn't stay. That night I packed a bag, grabbed my keys, and left. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. As I walked out the front door, I heard it again, the soft creak of the rocking chair echoing up from the basement. I didn't look back. I stayed at a motel that night, the kind with flickering neon signs and thin walls. It wasn't home, but it was safe. Or at least I thought it was. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The old woman, sitting in that chair, her eyes empty, her presence cold and unyielding. In the morning, I went back to the house. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I couldn't leave it like that. I had to do something. Had to find a way to put her to rest, or at least get rid of that damn chair. When I walked inside, the house felt different. Colder, darker, like it knew I was back. I made my way to the basement door, my heart pounding, my hands shaking as I turned the knob. The rocking chair was there, still and silent, the air around it heavy with that same floral scent. I stepped closer, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn and run. But I had to do this. I had to end whatever was keeping her here. I took a deep breath and moved towards the chair. The closer I got, the stronger the scent became, thick and almost suffocating now, like it was seeping into my skin. My eyes locked onto the rocking chair, its old darkened wood, the way it sat, just waiting for someone to come close. The basement felt like it was closing in around me, the shadows deepening, the air growing colder. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the back of the chair. The wood was cold, far colder than it should have been, almost icy to the touch. I pulled my hand back, a shiver running down my spine as I felt the cold spread through my fingertips. I could feel it now. This was her. She was still here, still holding on to this chair, this basement. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let her keep it. I couldn't let her stay. I turned, looking for something, anything that I could use to get rid of it. My eyes landed on an old can of lighter fluid, sitting on a shelf, covered in dust. My heart pounded in my ears as I grabbed it, my hands shaking as I unscrewed the cap. I moved back towards the chair, the smell of the fluid mixing with the floral perfume, creating a thick, nauseating scent that made my stomach turn. I poured it over the chair, the liquid soaking into the old wood. dripping onto the concrete floor. For a moment, I hesitated. What if this made it worse? What if burning the chair only made her angrier? But I couldn't live like this. Couldn't live with her, with the constant cold, the whispers, the feeling of her eyes on me. I pulled a box of matches from my pocket, striking one and holding it in my trembling hand. The flame flickered, casting long shadows across the basement walls, and for just a moment, I thought I saw her, standing there, in the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on me, her face twisted in a look of anger. I didn't wait. I tossed the match onto the chair, the flame catching immediately, the fire spreading quickly over the fluid-soaked wood. The basement filled with light, the flames crackling, the scent of burning wood and perfume filling the air. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my eyes locked on the chair as the flames consumed it. The figure in the corner vanished, swallowed by the fire. The fire spread faster than I expected. The heat grew intense, the flames licking at the walls, and I knew I had to get out. I turned and ran up the stairs, my feet pounding on the wooden steps, the smoke thick and choking in my lungs. I burst through the basement door, slamming it shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could feel the heat behind the door, hear the roar of the flames as they spread, but I didn't care. I stumbled out of the house, collapsing on the lawn, my hands trembling, my body shaking with fear and adrenaline. I sat there, watching as smoke began to billow out of the basement windows, the faint glow of the fire visible through the glass. The neighbors must have called the fire department, because before long, I heard the distant wail of sirens, growing louder, closer. I didn't move. I couldn't. I just sat there, staring at the house, watching as the fire spread, as the thick black smoke poured into the sky. The firefighters arrived, pulling hoses, shouting orders, working to put out the flames. One of them came over to me, asking if I was okay, if there was anyone else inside. I shook my head, my eyes still on the house. They worked quickly, and eventually the fire was out. The house was still standing, but it was scarred, blackened, the windows shattered, the air thick with smoke. I spent that night at a neighbor's house. They were kind, offered me food, a place to sleep, but I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. The old woman, her face twisted in anger, her eyes dark and empty. I could still feel her presence, even now, even here, like she was still watching me, still angry. The next morning, I went back to the house. It was a mess. Blackened walls, the smell of smoke lingering in the air, the basement door hanging open, revealing the charred remains of what had once been down there. I walked down the stairs slowly, each step heavy, the air thick with the scent of ash. The chair was gone, reduced to nothing but a pile of ashes and twisted metal springs. I stood there, staring at the spot where it had been, my heart pounding in my chest. It was over. She was gone. She had to be. But as I turned to leave, I felt it, a chill, creeping up my spine, settling in my bones. The basement, even now, felt cold. Too cold. I swallowed hard, refusing to look back, refusing to acknowledge the feeling. I walked up the stairs, each step echoing in the empty house, my eyes fixed on the door ahead. I moved out that same day. I packed what I could, left the rest behind. The house was too damaged to stay in, but even if it hadn't been, I couldn't stay. Not after everything. Not after what I had seen, what I had felt. I needed to leave, needed to put as much distance between myself and that basement as possible. I found another place, a small apartment in the city, nothing special but enough to start over. I tried to forget about the house, tried to move on, to convince myself that it was all over. But some nights, when everything is quiet, when the world is still, I swear I can hear it again, that soft, gentle creaking, like the sound of a rocking chair moving back and forth. I try to ignore it, try to tell myself it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. She's still out there, still watching, still waiting. I burned her chair, burned the place where she sat, but I didn't burn her. Whatever she is, whatever kept her in that house, it's not gone. It never will be. And now, every time I hear a creak in the night, every time I feel a chill pass through the room, I wonder if she's found me again. If she's still sitting there, rocking back and forth, her eyes fixed on me, her presence cold and unyielding. I keep the lights on now. I never leave the doors open, and I never ever go near basements, because I know one day I'll hear it again, clearer, closer, and she'll be there waiting just like before. and this time I don't think I'll be able to get away. I grew up on a mountain, not one of those fancy ski resort mountains with lodges and chairlifts. No, this was a quiet, secluded mountain, our cabin surrounded by endless woods, steep trails, and barely there neighbors. I liked it that way most of the time. The air was fresh, the views were stunning, and I had the entire forest as my playground. It was the kind of place where you could spend the whole day exploring and still never see another soul. But sometimes, the isolation got to me, and I longed for company. So, when a family moved in a few cabins away, another rare thing on our mountain, I was thrilled. Even better, they had two daughters around my age, Hannah and Claire. From the first day I met them, we became fast friends, spending hours together, running through the trees, climbing rocks, and playing all sorts of made-up games. They had a big old trampoline in their backyard, and we would jump on it for hours, laughing until our sides hurt. It was on one of those afternoons that I first saw it. We were taking turns bouncing, the other two cheering from the sides, and I was midair, suspended for just a moment, when I saw something through the old wooden fence that bordered their property. It was a shape, tall, bony, standing among the trees just on the other side. I blinked, the world blurring as I came back down, but it was gone. I hit the trampoline, then bounced back up, trying to see it again. Nothing. Just trees swaying in the afternoon wind. "What's up, Rachel?" Claire asked, noticing the way I kept squinting towards the fence. I shook my head, brushing it off. I thought I saw something, like a person or something. I laughed it off, even though my stomach nodded just a bit. Hannah, the older sister, tilted her head curiously. "Oh, probably just a hunter. We get them sometimes up here." She said it so casually, and for a moment, I let that explanation settle in my head. It made sense. Hunters were common in the woods. They stayed quiet, moved like shadows. Still, as we kept playing, I couldn't quite shake that feeling, that something had been there, standing still, watching us. The longer I thought about it, the more I realized it wasn't just the shape of a person that had unsettled me. There was something wrong about it, something off. It had seemed too thin, its limbs too long. I convinced myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light and my imagination running wild. But that night, as the sun began to set behind the mountain and the cool evening air set in, I was about to head home when Hannah spoke up, her voice unusually quiet. "Hey Rachel, can I tell you something weird?" she asked, glancing over at Claire, who was sitting cross-legged on the ground, braiding grass absent-mindedly. I shrugged, intrigued. "Sure." Hannah glanced around, as if making sure no one else was listening, even though we were alone. She leaned in, her voice just above a whisper. "At night, sometimes, we see something in our room." A chill ran down my back, and I frowned. "Like what?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice trembled just a bit. Claire looked up, her eyes wide, her fingers stopping mid-braid. "It's a skeleton," she said. There was something about the way she said it, so matter-of-fact, like it wasn't strange at all, like she was talking about a spider in the corner of the room. I laughed, though it came out nervous. "A skeleton? Come on, you guys, you're just trying to scare me." But neither of them smiled. Hannah shook her head, her face serious. "No, really. It shows up sometimes, just standing in the corner of the room. It doesn't do anything, just stares at us. And then, when we blink or turn on the light, it's gone." I didn't know what to say. My first instinct was to dismiss it, say they were just imagining things. But something in their faces, in the way they spoke, told me they believed it. I felt the hair on the back of my neck prickling, a creeping unease settling over me. "Have you told your parents?" I asked. Claire shook her head, her eyes wide and fearful. "They wouldn't believe us. Besides, it doesn't hurt us or anything. It just stands there." She looked at Hannah, as if waiting for her older sister to confirm it, and Hannah nodded. "It's almost like it's guarding something," Hannah added. "I don't know, we only see it sometimes, but it's always when it's really late, and the room is really dark. I hate it." I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. I wanted to tell them they were being silly, that it was just shadows or a bad dream. But the truth was I believed them. I'd seen that figure by the fence, hadn't I? Just for a moment, but it had felt real enough. The rest of that evening felt heavy, the air around us thick with unspoken fear. We tried to keep playing, tried to laugh it off, but the mood had shifted. Eventually, I said goodbye and headed home, my footsteps echoing against the gravel path, the darkening woods seeming to close in on either side. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder, every gust of wind against the windows a potential intruder. My mind kept drifting back to that figure by the fence, to Hannah and Claire's whispered story. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my eyes heavy, but sleep wouldn't come. And then, around midnight, I heard something, a sound so soft I almost missed it, a faint creaking like wood shifting under weight. My heart pounded in my chest, and I held my breath, straining to hear. Creak, creak. It was coming from outside, from somewhere near the back of the house. Slowly I slipped out of bed, my bare feet touching the cold wooden floor, the chill of the mountain night seeping up through the boards. I tiptoed to the window, peering out through the gap in the curtain. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the yard. For a moment I didn't see anything, but then my eyes adjusted, and there it was, standing by the fence. The shape was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs bony and angular. The moonlight seemed to pass right through it, as if it was barely there, just a suggestion of a figure. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me, watching. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. My heart was racing, panic rising in my chest. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself to wake up, that this had to be a nightmare. But when I opened my eyes, I could still see it, just standing there, unmoving. Without thinking, I turned and ran, my feet pounding on the floor as I made my way down the hallway to my parents' room. I burst through the door, my voice trembling as I called out to them. "Mom! Dad! There's someone outside!" My dad jumped out of bed, grabbing the flashlight from his nightstand. He followed me back to my room, his heavy footsteps echoing down the hall. But by the time we got there, by the time he shone the flashlight through the window, the figure was gone. The yard was empty, the fence just a line of weathered wood in the moonlight. My dad sighed, ruffling my hair. "It's just shadows, Rachel. The woods can play tricks on you at night." He tried to sound reassuring, but I could see the confusion in his eyes, the way he looked at the yard a moment longer before turning away. He didn't say anything else, just walked back to his room, the flashlight beam bobbing with each step. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the window, my eyes fixed on the yard, watching, waiting. But the figure didn't come back. The next morning, I went to see Hannah and Claire. They were sitting on the trampoline, their faces pale, their eyes tired. I knew, without them saying anything, that they had seen it too. We didn't talk about it at first. We just sat there, the trampoline swaying slightly under our weight, the wind rustling through the trees around us. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "It was in our room last night. The skeleton. It was closer this time, right by the bed." Hannah nodded, her face tight, her hands clenched in her lap. "I don't think it wants us here," she said, her voice trembling. I think it wants us to leave." A shiver ran through me, and I glanced back at the fence, the trees beyond it swaying gently in the breeze. There was something there, something that didn't want us on this mountain, something that was watching us, waiting. They say you never really know yourself until you've tested your limits. That's what I was thinking when I decided to take a solo camping trip out at Lake Trinity. I had always been a city guy, preferring the chaos of traffic and streetlights to the quiet rustling of the woods. But senior year had worn me down. The stress of classes, the looming specter of adulthood, job applications, everything had piled up to the point where I needed an escape. So I decided, why not go camping? It was early spring break, and I had a whole week to myself. I thought it'd be the perfect chance to get out there, breathe some fresh air, and clear my mind before graduation. My friends thought I was crazy. "Lake Trinity? By yourself?" they asked, eyebrows raised. And yeah, sure, maybe it wasn't the best idea to go alone. But I was stubborn, and I'd already made up my mind. I wanted peace, solitude, and a break from everything. I packed light, tent, some canned food, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a knife, and one of those portable camping stoves my uncle had given me. I remember the drive down to Texas being almost therapeutic. The weather was perfect, the sky blue, and the air still held a crisp bite of late winter. By the time I got to the edge of Lake Trinity, The sun was already dipping low, painting everything in a golden glow. It was beautiful, in that untouched, wild kind of way. Setting up camp by the lake was a surprisingly smooth affair. I found a small clearing near the water's edge, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to sway and sink with the light breeze. The lake itself was tranquil, with only a few ripples here and there, reflecting the dimming sky like a mirror. I started a fire, got my tent up, and made myself some canned chili. For a while, it felt perfect. There was this strange satisfaction in sitting there, alone, in the quiet wilderness. As night fell, though, everything changed. It's funny how different the woods feel at night. What had been peaceful during the day seemed to shift into something darker as the sun disappeared. The wind picked up a little, brushing through the branches, making them creak. Shadows stretched and moved with every flicker of the campfire, and I began to feel the weight of the solitude I'd craved so much. But it wasn't until around midnight that things got strange. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers, just about ready to turn in for the night. That's when I heard it, this crunching noise coming from the woods behind me. Just a slight sound, the unmistakable snap of a twig. I froze, my hand holding the stick halfway to the fire. I listened, straining my ears against the surrounding silence. The sound came again. Crunch, crunch, closer this time. My heart started to pound in my chest, this dull, insistent thudding. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal. Deer, raccoon, maybe even a rabbit. But there was something about it, something deliberate. Slow, steady footsteps that seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. I called out, my voice cracking a little as I said, "Hey, anyone there?" The words sounded weak, getting swallowed up by the darkness almost immediately. I was met with silence, and I chuckled nervously, shaking my head, convincing myself I was being paranoid. I threw another log onto the fire, making it crackle and flare up. The bright flames should have made me feel safer, but instead, they cast more shadows, giving the woods a flickering, almost haunted look. The wind picked up again, and I heard something else, a whispering, a rustle that wasn't quite the wind. It sounded like voices? Or maybe just one voice, soft and distant, as if someone was talking just beyond the edge of the clearing. That was when I started to feel it. The unmistakable, skin-crawling sensation of being watched. It started in the pit of my stomach and spread out until my whole body felt tense, every nerve on high alert. I turned, scanning the woods, the darkness between the trees. There was nothing there, no movement, but I couldn't shake that feeling. It was like eyes were on me, staring from the depths of the forest. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was all in my head, but I couldn't ignore the instinct that something wasn't right. I stood up, rubbing my hands together, trying to shake off the cold that had suddenly settled in my bones. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the tree line. The beam cut through the darkness, but it didn't reveal anything except for the tall, swaying pines. No animals, no figures, nothing that should make me feel the way I was feeling. I decided to go into my tent and call it a night. I figured I'd feel better once I was zipped up in my sleeping bag, the tent flaps closed, with the barrier of nylon between me and the outside world. I crawled inside, zipped myself in, and turned off my flashlight, lying there in the darkness, trying to listen to my own breathing and ignore everything else. But that's when I heard it, a gunshot. It wasn't loud like in movies. It was muffled by distance, but unmistakable. My eyes flew open, my body going rigid. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter, even though it wasn't hunting season. But then it happened again, closer this time. Bang! My breath caught in my throat. I was lying there, trying to convince myself it wasn't what I thought it was, that I hadn't just heard gunfire. The footsteps returned, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. My mouth went dry, and I could barely move. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't an animal. Someone was out there. I could hear their heavy breathing, the unmistakable crunch of leaves under their boots. Panic surged through me, and I realized that the tent, this flimsy piece of fabric, was no protection at all. I had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. I reached for my backpack, fumbling for the knife I'd packed. My fingers shook, struggling to find the handle in the dark. I could hear the steps getting closer, and my heart pounded so hard I thought it would explode. The footsteps stopped right in front of the tent flap. There was a moment of silence so complete, I thought I could hear the air moving. And then, Without warning, the tent shook violently, as if someone had grabbed it and pulled. I screamed. I didn't even recognize my own voice. It was raw, full of fear. I slashed out with the knife, the blade ripping through the fabric, and I saw a shadow move, retreating, followed by another gunshot, louder this time. I didn't think. I just moved, scrambling out of the torn tent, the cold night air hitting me like a punch to the chest. I ran. I didn't look back. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my feet stumbling over roots and rocks. My mind was blank except for one thought: run. I could still hear something behind me, heavy footsteps, someone pursuing me. There was another gunshot, and I ducked instinctively, tripping over my own feet and falling face first into the dirt. Pain shot through my knee, but I pushed myself up, adrenaline drowning out everything else. The lake. I knew if I could just make it to the lake, I might have a chance. I could hear the water, the sound of waves gently hitting the shore, and I pushed myself towards it, breaking through the tree line, my breath ragged and burning. The moon was bright, reflecting off the lake's surface, and I could see the dark shape of my canoe pulled up on the shore. I stumbled towards it, my hands shaking as I untied the rope, shoving it into the water. I jumped in, grabbing the paddle, my entire body aching. I pushed off, paddling furiously, my arms screaming with pain, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if someone was still there, standing on the shore watching me. I just kept paddling out into the middle of the lake until my arms could barely move anymore, until I was surrounded by nothing but water and darkness. Finally, I let the paddle rest across my knees, my breath coming in gasps. I turned, looking back at the shore, at the tree line now just a dark silhouette against the sky. There was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the quiet lapping of water against the canoe. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my eyes never leaving the shore, waiting for something, anything, to appear. But nothing did. Slowly, the fear began to drain out of me, leaving only exhaustion in its place. I felt the tears come then, hot and sudden, and I let them fall, the realization of how close I'd come to dying hitting me all at once. I don't know who was out there or why they were after me, but I knew one thing for sure: I was never going camping again. When the sun finally started to rise, I paddled back to the shore. I could see my campsite from a distance, the remnants of my tent, torn and crumpled, the ashes of the fire pit. It looked almost normal, as if what had happened had been just a nightmare, something my mind had conjured up in the darkness. But I knew it was real. The fear I felt, the sound of those footsteps, the gunshots, none of that was my imagination. I beached the canoe, my legs trembling as I stepped out onto solid ground. My whole body ached, my muscles felt like they were on fire, and my knee throbbed where I'd fallen the night before. But I forced myself to move, to pack up whatever I could. The tent was shredded, pieces of it hanging from branches where I had slashed at it in a panic. I stuffed it all into my backpack without bothering to fold it properly. I just wanted to leave, to get out of that place as fast as I could. The entire time I was packing, I felt exposed. The morning light brought no comfort. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call felt like a warning. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that shadowy figure again, standing between the trees. But there was nothing. No footprints, no signs of someone having been there at all. It was like the night before had been wiped clean, leaving only my fear behind. I managed to get everything packed up and headed towards the trail that led back to where I had parked my car. The woods were silent, almost unnaturally so. It felt like even the birds had stopped singing, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I forced myself to keep walking, to focus on the path ahead. Each step felt heavier than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was as if the trees themselves had eyes, following my every move. When I finally reached my car, I almost cried with relief. It was still there, untouched, just as I had left it. I threw my backpack into the back seat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys, struggling to get them into the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I pulled out of there as fast as I could, the gravel crunching under my tires as I sped away from that place. As I drove, the fear slowly began to fade, replaced by a strange numbness. I couldn't wrap my head around what had happened. Who had been out there? Why were they after me? There were so many questions and no answers. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had never been so scared in my life. And that feeling of being hunted, of knowing that someone wanted to hurt me, it stayed with me long after I had left Lake Trinity behind. For weeks afterward, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, convinced that I could hear footsteps outside my window, or the soft rustle of someone moving in the shadows. I even thought about going to the police, but what would I tell them? That I heard footsteps and gunshots while I was camping alone in the middle of nowhere? I didn't have any proof, and part of me was afraid they'd just think I was crazy, or worse, that I had imagined the whole thing. In the end, I tried to move on. I told myself that it was just a one-time thing, that I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe it had been a poacher or some kind of criminal trying to scare me off. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I knew that whoever was out there had been hunting me, that they had wanted to hurt me, maybe even kill me. It's been over a year since that night, and I still think about it all the time. I haven't gone camping since, not alone, not with friends, not at all. The idea of sleeping in a tent, out in the open, vulnerable, makes my skin crawl. I used to think that nature was beautiful, that the woods were a place of peace and tranquility. But now, when I think of the woods, all I can remember is that cold fear, the sense of being watched, the feeling of running for my life through the darkness. The thing that scares me the most, though, is that I'll never know who it was or why they were there. There's no closure, no neat ending where the bad guy gets caught and I get to move on. It's just this lingering fear, this knowledge that somewhere out there in the vast wilderness, there are things that don't want to be found. People who hide in the shadows, waiting. And I was unlucky enough to stumble across one of them. Sometimes when I'm out late at night, walking to my car, I swear I can still feel it. That prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the sense of eyes watching me from the darkness. And I turn, expecting to see someone there, just a shadow slipping out of sight. But there's never anyone there. Just the empty night, silent and still. It's a feeling I don't think I'll ever shake, that somewhere, somehow, someone is still out there watching, waiting. That trip to Lake Trinity was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to connect with nature, to find some peace. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life, something that changed the way I see the world. Now I know there are places where we aren't meant to go alone, places where something waits in the dark, patient and silent. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you might hear a twig snap or a whisper through the trees. And if you do, my advice is to run. Don't look back, don't hesitate, just run. Because some things out there aren't meant to be found, and some shadows should never be followed. When we first moved into the house, I was struck by how normal it all seemed. The neighborhood was quiet, the lawn perfectly manicured, and the house itself, white picket fence and all, looked like something out of a suburban dream. After years of cramped apartments and noisy neighbors, it felt like we had finally found a place where we could breathe. It was just me and Rachel, two people, a handful of boxes, and a lot of hope for a fresh start. The rooms were bright, spacious, and filled with light that poured in from the large windows. Everything had a comfortable stillness, like the house had been waiting for us. But there was one part of the house that didn't fit that feeling, the room at the end of the upstairs hallway. From the very first day, it felt different. The door was closed when we arrived, and even after we opened it, it remained strange, like it didn't quite belong to the rest of the house. The air inside was cooler, almost unnaturally so, and there was a dampness, like a basement after a heavy rain. The window in the room was locked tight, and no matter how much I tried to unlatch it, it wouldn't budge. Rachel joked that it was the house's way of keeping its secrets, but every time I stepped into that room, I felt like an intruder. Still, it was just a room, and there was so much to do, unpacking, arranging furniture, making the place ours. For the first couple of weeks, we ignored it, closing the door and focusing on everything else. Life settled into a comfortable routine. We cooked dinner together in the evenings, binge-watched shows on the living room couch, and started to feel like this was our home. Then the noises started. It was subtle at first, a creak here, a thud there, easy enough to dismiss. Houses settle, after all, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Every night, like clockwork, I would hear a low, dragging noise from somewhere upstairs, the sound echoing faintly down the hallway. Rachel tried to laugh it off. "Old houses have character," she said, her smile wavering just enough that I knew she felt it too, that creeping sense that something wasn't quite right. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, I heard it again, a faint scratching noise, like nails on wood, coming from the direction of the mysterious room. Rachel froze, her toothbrush halfway to her mouth, and our eyes met in the bathroom mirror. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes wide. "Maybe we should check it out?" she suggested, though there was a tremor in her voice that told me she hoped I would say no. I swallowed hard, trying to ignore the feeling of my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah, let's go." We made our way down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door to the room was slightly ajar, the darkness beyond it yawning and thick. I pushed it open, and the cool air hit us immediately, colder than usual, the kind that makes you shiver down to your bones. The scratching had stopped, and the room was silent, almost too silent. I could hear my own breath, see Rachel's face pale in the dim light from the hallway. Nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was exactly as we'd left it, an empty desk by the locked window, a dusty rug on the floor. And yet the room felt wrong, like it was watching us, like the air itself was alive. I wanted to leave, to close the door and never come back, but a part of me, a curious, fearful part, needed to understand, needed to know what was happening. Rachel shook her head. "Let's just go," she whispered, her hand closing around my arm. I nodded, and we backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind us with a quiet click. But that night, as we lay in bed, neither of us could sleep. I stared at the ceiling, listening, waiting, feeling the minutes stretch on endlessly. It got worse after that. The noises were no longer confined to nighttime. They started happening in the daytime, soft whispers just at the edge of hearing, thumps that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Rachel tried to act like it was fine, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she started avoiding the end of the hallway entirely, her gaze flickering nervously in that direction whenever she walked past. I wasn't much better. Every time I passed that door, I felt it, a chill that sank into my skin, a sense of being watched, like something was standing just on the other side, waiting for me to come closer. I started keeping it locked, though I had no memory of ever finding a key. Somehow it just turned up one day, sitting on the windowsill, old and rusted, like it had always been there. I used it without question, relief washing over me as the lock clicked into place. But the strange feeling of being watched didn't stop. It grew stronger. One night I woke up to find the bedroom door open, though I was sure I had closed it. The air felt wrong, too cold, like that room at the end of the hall. And as I sat up, blinking into the darkness, I heard it again. My name, a whisper, soft and echoing, as if carried on a breath of cold wind. "Tom." The voice was faint, almost gentle, but it froze the blood in my veins. I turned my head slowly, my eyes straining in the darkness, and there, at the end of the hallway, was the door. It was open. The lock, the one I had checked and double-checked, was undone, the door slightly ajar, darkness spilling out like ink. My heart pounded in my ears, my mouth dry as sandpaper. I wanted to get up, to close it, to lock it again, but I couldn't move. I couldn't bring myself to step out of the bed, out into the cold, watching darkness. Rachel stirred beside me, her eyes opening, confusion etched on her face as she followed my gaze to the open door. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "Tom, what is happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, a tremor running through it. I didn't have an answer. I didn't even know what was real anymore. I tried to speak, to reassure her, but the words caught in my throat. Slowly, as if in a trance, I pushed myself out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor, my body trembling. I stepped out into the hallway, each breath coming out in shallow gasps, the darkness seeming to close in around me. The door at the end of the hallway was fully open now, the room beyond nothing but a black void, the cool air spilling out like a fog. I took another step, then another, my legs moving without thought, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake the entire house. And then I saw it, a shape in the darkness, a figure standing in the center of the room, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its head brushing the ceiling, its face obscured, a deep, hollow darkness where features should have been. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt my knees buckle, a wave of terror washing over me so intense that I thought I might pass out. The figure moved, just a slight tilt of the head, as if it had finally noticed me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare into that empty, yawning face. Rachel screamed behind me, the sound breaking the spell that had held me frozen. I turned, stumbling back into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me, my hands shaking so violently I could barely turn the key in the lock. I could hear Rachel crying, her sobs echoing down the hallway, and I rushed back to her, wrapping my arms around her, whispering that it was okay, that we were okay, though I knew neither of us believed it. The next day, we packed our things. We didn't talk about what we had seen, what we had felt, but the silence between us said enough. We couldn't stay. The house, with its bright rooms and manicured lawn, had become a place of nightmares, the sense of something lurking just out of sight too much to bear. We locked the front door behind us, the keys cold in my hand, and walked away without looking back. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. That whisper, soft and cold, calling my name from somewhere far away. I try to ignore it, try to convince myself it's just a memory, just the echo of fear that refuses to fade. But deep down, I know it's still there. That room, that figure, that cold, watchful presence, waiting for someone else to open the door, to let it out. And I can't help but wonder if one day I'll hear it again, not from a memory, but from the shadows of whatever room I'm in, whispering my name, just like before. We moved into an apartment in the city, a small, one-bedroom place with thin walls and noisy neighbors, and it was a relief in every way. The constant sounds of the traffic outside, the muffled chatter from next door, even the distant wail of sirens, it all reminded me that we were back among the living, back to a world that made sense. Rachel tried to smile more, tried to put on a brave face, but I could see the shadows that still clung to her. Some nights, I'd wake up to find her sitting in the living room, the television on, her eyes glazed over as she stared at the flickering screen. She would jump when I approached, as if she had forgotten I was there. "You okay?" I would ask, my voice soft in the dark, and she'd nod, forcing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Just couldn't sleep," she'd say, and I knew what she meant. I understood it all too well. For a while, things seemed like they might get better. We were away from the house, away from whatever had been lurking in that room. We started to fall back into something like normal, going out to dinner, seeing friends again, making new routines. I almost let myself believe that it was over, that we had escaped it. But deep down, I knew better. The whispers started again 2 weeks after we moved. It was late, just after midnight, and I was lying in bed, my eyes heavy with sleep, when I heard it, faint at first, almost like a breeze. "Tom." I sat up, my heart pounding, my gaze darting around the dark room. It was coming from the hallway, the narrow hallway that led from our bedroom to the rest of the apartment. I felt the chill settle in my chest, the same coldness that had always come with the room at the end of the hall. I could feel my pulse quickening, fear snaking through me as the whisper came again. "Tom." Rachel stirred beside me, her brow furrowed, and I knew I couldn't wake her. I couldn't let her hear it again, not after everything she had already been through. I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet touching the floor without a sound. The hallway was dark, the shadows long and deep, and as I stepped out, I could feel the cold air hit me, the temperature dropping with every step I took. It was the same feeling, the coldness, the sense of something just out of sight, just waiting. I turned on the hallway light, the bulb flickering briefly before illuminating the narrow space. There was nothing there, no figures, no movement, just the quiet stillness of an empty apartment. But I felt it. The eyes on me, the same unblinking gaze that had watched me from the shadows of that room. It was like a heavy weight pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I clenched my teeth, shaking my head, trying to push the feeling away. I walked to the living room, turning on every light as I went, the brightness chasing away the dark corners. The whispers stopped, leaving only the sound of the refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen, the distant honk of a car horn from the street below. I stood there for a long moment, my hands clenched into fists, my mind racing. It was here. It had followed us. The next morning, I tried to tell Rachel, but the words wouldn't come. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine, and I knew she could see the fear. But I couldn't say it. I couldn't make it real for her again. So I lied. I forced a smile, told her everything was fine, that I was just having trouble sleeping. She nodded, though I could see the doubt in her eyes. But it wasn't just the whispers. It was the feeling of being watched, the way the apartment seemed to grow colder at night, the way shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far. I started seeing things, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shape standing just beyond the doorway when I turned off the lights. It was always there, always just out of sight. One night, as Rachel was getting ready for bed, I heard her gasp from the bathroom. I rushed in, my heart in my throat, and found her standing there, staring at the mirror, her face pale. I followed her gaze, my eyes widening as I saw it. The words, written in the fog on the bathroom mirror. 4 letters, scrawled across the glass, dripping as if they had just been written. Tom. Rachel turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "Did you do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. I could see the tears welling up in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she reached out to touch the letters, her fingers brushing against the cold glass. "We need to leave," she said, her voice breaking. "We need to get out of here, Tom, please." I nodded. She was right. We couldn't stay. Not when it was clear that whatever had been in that room, whatever had whispered my name in the darkness, had followed us here. It wasn't just the house. It was something else. Something that wanted me, something that wouldn't let go. The next day we packed again. It felt like déjà vu, cramming our belongings into bags, the urgency, the fear, the desperate need to escape. We didn't know where we were going, only that we couldn't stay. We left the apartment, the lights still on, the door locked behind us, and drove without a destination, the silence between us thick with unspoken fear. We found a motel on the outskirts of town, one of those places that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s, with faded wallpaper and a flickering neon sign out front. It was small, cramped, but it was somewhere we could hide, somewhere that felt far enough away. That first night, we stayed up together, the television on, the volume low, the flicker of old sitcoms casting long shadows across the room. I held Rachel's hand, her fingers cold against mine, and I tried to pretend that it was going to be okay, that we had left it all behind. But I knew better. At around 3 a.m., I heard it again. A whisper, so soft I almost missed it, drifting through the room like a cold breeze. "Tom." Rachel squeezed my hand, her eyes wide, tears slipping down her cheeks. She heard it too. We both turned toward the door, the cheap wooden panel rattling slightly, as if someone was standing just outside, pushing against it, waiting for us to let them in. I stood, my legs shaking, and moved towards the door. The whisper came again, louder this time, insistent, echoing through the small motel room. "Tom." I reached out, my hand hovering over the doorknob, and I felt it. The cold, the same bone-deep chill that had filled that room at the end of the hallway. I turned, looking back at Rachel, her eyes wide with fear, her head shaking, silently begging me not to open it. I pulled my hand away. I couldn't do it. I couldn't let it in. Instead, I backed away, my heart pounding, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I grabbed the chair from the small table and wedged it under the doorknob, the wooden legs scraping against the floor. Rachel watched, her body trembling, her eyes never leaving the door. We stayed like that until morning, sitting together on the bed, the door blocked, the whispers slowly fading as the first light of dawn crept in through the curtains. When the sun finally rose, the cold receded, the sense of being watched slipping away with the night. We didn't talk about it. We packed our bags again, the third time in as many months, and we left. I don't know where we're going now, somewhere far, somewhere new, somewhere that maybe, just maybe, it can't follow. But I can still feel it. I can still hear it sometimes in the quiet moments between heartbeats. A whisper, soft and cold, calling my name. I don't know if we'll ever really escape it, if there's anywhere we can go where it won't find us. But I have to try. For Rachel, for myself, I have to keep moving, keep running until there's nowhere left to go. And maybe someday I'll turn around and it won't be there anymore. Maybe someday the whispers will stop and I'll finally be free of the cold, watchful presence that haunts me. But until then, I keep moving, keep running, and I never, ever look back. The day Jason and his family moved into the old house in rural Louisiana, it felt like they were stepping back in time. It was a lonely Victorian house, surrounded by thick, towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The forest was dense, swallowing the property on all sides, and there was a kind of silence there that Jason wasn't used to, an almost unnatural stillness, as though the world around them was holding its breath. Jason's parents, along with their golden retriever Rusty, had decided they needed a change of pace, a slower life, away from the chaos of the city. But there was something about the house that didn't sit right with Jason from the moment he saw it. It loomed large, its weathered wooden walls seeming to hold countless secrets, and the way it creaked and groaned as they explored made him feel like they were intruders rather than new owners. The first few nights were restless. Jason tried to settle into his new room, but the strange sounds kept him awake. The wind howling through the trees, branches scratching against the windows, and the distant rustle of underbrush. Rusty was uneasy too. He would wander around the house, whimpering occasionally. His ears perked as though he heard something no one else could. And every night, without fail, he would plant himself in front of the living room window, staring out into the dark forest beyond, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Probably just getting used to the place, Jason's dad said, though even he seemed unnerved by Rusty's behavior. The dog would bark at nothing, hackles raised, his eyes fixed on something just beyond the range of their sight. It made Jason feel a constant, crawling unease, as if something was out there, watching them. It wasn't long before they met Nolan. Jason first saw him while he was helping his dad repair the fence along the back edge of their property. He had glanced up, catching sight of a figure standing just beyond the tree line, a man watching them. He was tall, with a thin frame, and as Jason's eyes adjusted to the shadows, the man stepped forward, smiling. His eyes were piercing, the kind that seemed to look right through you, and his smile held no warmth. "Afternoon," the man called out, his voice carrying easily through the thick, humid air. He approached with a slow, deliberate gait, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. Jason's dad straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Hello there. Can I help you?" There was a cautious tone to his voice that Jason rarely heard. "Name's Nolan," the man said, stopping just shy of the fence. "I live nearby. Just wanted to come by and welcome y'all to the neighborhood." His eyes flickered from Jason's dad to Jason, and for a moment they lingered, unblinking. Jason felt a chill run down his spine. There was something off about Nolan, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Well, thank you," Jason's dad replied, though there was an awkwardness in the air. "We're still settling in, but it's nice to meet a neighbor." Nolan nodded slowly, his gaze shifting back to Jason. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to come find me. I'm always close by." The way he said it made Jason shiver. Nolan's smile widened slightly, but it didn't touch his eyes. He gave a curt nod and turned, disappearing into the woods as quietly as he had appeared. That night, Jason couldn't shake the image of Nolan's face, his eyes, the way they seemed to bore into him. When he mentioned the encounter at dinner, his dad's expression darkened. "Nolan? I don't know about that guy," his dad said, shaking his head. "Just steer clear of him, all right, Jason? Something about him doesn't sit right with me." Jason nodded, though he couldn't help but feel a pull of curiosity. Nolan had been strange, yes, but there was something fascinating about him too, like he was a part of the mystery that hung over the house and the woods around it. The following days only grew stranger. Rusty's behavior became more erratic. He would bark at the window every night, his ears pinned back, his tail rigid. Jason started to hear things too, soft noises in the walls, almost like whispers, and the unmistakable creak of footsteps in the hallway late at night. Whenever he checked, there was no one there. The feeling of being watched never left him, a weight that settled in his chest and grew heavier with each passing day. One night, as Jason lay in bed, he awoke suddenly, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what had stirred him, but the room felt different, colder, as if a draft had swept through. He listened, his breath shallow, and then he heard it. Jason. It was faint, almost too quiet to be real, a whisper that seemed to come from just outside his window. His stomach knotted, and he sat up slowly, his eyes wide as he stared at the curtain. Jason. The voice came again, soft and insistent. Rusty, lying at the foot of his bed, began to growl, the fur along his back standing on end. Jason's mouth went dry, and he swung his legs over the side of the bed, his feet touching the cold wooden floor. He moved to the window, his hands trembling as he reached for the curtain. Slowly, he pulled it aside, his breath hitching in his throat. Standing in the yard, bathed in the pale glow of the moonlight, was Nolan. He was staring up at Jason's window, his head tilted slightly, his eyes wide and unblinking. But it wasn't just Nolan, it was the way he looked. His face was wrong, his features stretched as if they had melted and then hardened in unnatural positions. His smile was too wide, his teeth glinting in the dim light. Jason gasped, stumbling backward, the curtain slipping from his hand and falling back into place. Rusty began barking furiously, the sound echoing through the house, and within moments, Jason's parents were at his door, their faces pale with confusion and fear. "He's out there," Jason managed to say, his voice shaking. "Nolan, he's in the yard." His dad rushed to the window, yanking the curtain aside, but the yard was empty. There was nothing there, just the swaying trees and the shadowed grass. Jason's mom put a comforting hand on his shoulder, but he could see the worry in her eyes, the way her gaze flickered between him and the window. The next day, his dad made some calls, trying to find out more about Nolan, but no one knew him. There were no neighbors named Nolan, no records of anyone with that name in the area. It was as if the man had never existed, a figment of their collective imagination. But Jason knew what he had seen, and the unease that had settled over their family only deepened. The final straw came just a few nights later. The whispers returned, louder this time, calling Jason's name over and over, insistent, demanding. He lay in bed, his body rigid, tears welling in his eyes as the voice seemed to seep through the walls, wrapping around him like a cold, invisible hand. Rusty barked and growled, his eyes fixed on the window, but Jason refused to look, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. By morning, his parents had made up their minds. They couldn't stay, not after everything that had happened. The house, with its creaking floors and darkened hallways, had become a place of fear, an oppressive presence pressing down on them until they could hardly breathe. They packed in a rush, the tension palpable, each of them desperate to leave and never look back. As they drove away, Jason couldn't help but turn for one last look at the house. It stood silent and dark, the forest pressing in on all sides. For a moment, just before the trees swallowed it from view, Jason thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods, a tall man with a twisted smile, watching them go. He blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving only the swaying branches and the rustling leaves. The drive back to the city was quiet, the weight slowly lifting from Jason's chest as the miles stretched on. Rusty lay in the back seat, finally calm, his eyes closed as if in relief. Jason took a deep breath, his heart rate finally starting to slow, the tension ebbing away. They never spoke of Nolan again. It was easier to pretend he hadn't existed, that the strange man was nothing more than a bad dream brought on by the isolation of that old house. But sometimes, late at night, Jason would wake with his heart pounding, the faint echo of his name still lingering in his ears, a whisper from a memory he wished he could forget. Moving into a new place is often filled with excitement and a hint of anxiety. I thought the old Victorian house on Maple Street would be the perfect refuge, a quiet space to focus on my work and escape the noise of the city. I had envisioned long afternoons spent writing in peace, surrounded by creaking floorboards and the scent of aged wood. But I quickly learned that this house had secrets of its own, secrets that would shatter the tranquility I sought and plunge me into a nightmarish reality. The moment I stepped inside the house, I felt a shiver creep down my spine. The air was thick and heavy, as if it had been trapped within the walls for years. The sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "I think this will be perfect," I murmured to myself, trying to convince my rattled nerves. The realtor had promised the attic would be a great storage space, but as I stood at the base of the stairs leading up to it, a gnawing sense of unease filled my chest. The first night was uneventful. I spent it unpacking boxes, the mundane task providing a comforting distraction from the lingering chill in the air. But as the sun set and the darkness enveloped the house, the atmosphere shifted. I felt an unsettling silence, the kind that hangs in the air just before a storm. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a soft thud from the attic. My heart raced as I strained to listen. Was it just my imagination? I waited, holding my breath, until the sound came again, a scraping noise, as if something were being dragged across the wooden floorboards. Against my better judgment, curiosity propelled me to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking ominously beneath my weight. The attic door was slightly ajar, the faint light from my flashlight flickering ominously. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the heavy silence that wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. I pushed the door open, revealing the attic's dark expanse. Shadows danced along the walls, and dust motes floated in the beam of my light. And then I saw her. A woman sat on a tattered bed in the far corner, her back to me. Her hair was a wild tangle of dark curls, and her skin was as pale as the moonlight filtering through the window. She wore a long, faded dress that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. "Who are you?" I whispered, fear clenching my gut. She began to mumble something, the words indistinct and laced with an eerie cadence. My breath caught in my throat as I took a tentative step forward. "Ma'am?" The woman didn't respond. She simply continued to murmur, her voice rising and falling like a haunting melody. Instinct kicked in, and I turned to flee. My feet pounded against the stairs as I rushed back down, the sounds of her murmurs echoing in my ears. I stumbled into my bedroom, slamming the door behind me, my heart racing. The next day, I called the police, my hands trembling as I recounted the events of the night before. "I'm sorry, sir," the officer said, skepticism lacing his tone. "But we didn't find anything unusual. Are you sure it wasn't just the wind or perhaps your imagination?" I felt a mixture of anger and fear swelling within me. "No, there was someone up there, a woman." "Okay, we'll send someone to check again," he replied, his voice calm but lacking conviction. I hung up, frustration boiling within me. I didn't need validation from them. I had seen her. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder now, echoing through the walls, wrapping around me like a chilling embrace. Sleep eluded me as I lay awake, the cold fingers of fear creeping deeper into my mind. As days turned into weeks, the woman became a permanent fixture in my life. I could hear her murmuring every night, the sounds growing louder, more frantic. I tried to focus on my work, but the tension weighed heavily on my mind, making every word I typed feel hollow and pointless. "Maybe I should just leave," I whispered to myself one night, staring at the flickering candle on my desk. But I was drawn to the mystery of the woman in the attic. Who was she? Why was she there? Desperation clawed at my insides, pushing me closer to the edge of sanity. I knew I had to confront her again. The following night, I climbed the attic stairs once more, my flashlight illuminating the dusty path ahead. My heart raced as I approached the corner where she always sat. "Why are you here?" I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. She slowly turned to face me, her eyes dark voids that seemed to pull me in. "You should not have come here," she whispered, her voice low and haunting. "They'll know." "Who will know?" I asked, trembling as her words sent a chill down my spine. "The ones who watch," she replied, her gaze intense. "You've disturbed them." My pulse quickened, and fear flooded my veins. Disturbed who? But before she could answer, a loud crash echoed through the attic, and I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. It rolled away, plunging us into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to find the light. The shadows around me shifted and twisted, taking on ominous shapes that loomed closer. "What's happening?" I gasped, my breath quickening. "They've come," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. I finally found the flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. But as the light flickered to life, the woman had vanished. The attic felt impossibly vast and empty, the shadows retreating as if they were alive. I turned to leave, but a figure emerged from the darkened corner, a tall, gaunt shape with hollow eyes staring back at me. It reached out, its fingers elongated and claw-like, and I screamed, bolting for the door. I rushed down the stairs, the sound of my pounding heart drowning out everything else. I threw open the front door and stumbled outside, gasping for breath as the cool night air hit my face. I could still hear her whispers in my mind, echoing endlessly as I stood there, terrified and disoriented. "I have to get out of here," I muttered, glancing back at the house, which loomed over me like a malevolent giant. The flickering light in the attic danced like a taunting flame, and I realized I couldn't stay. I packed my things hurriedly, my hands shaking as I tossed clothes and belongings into boxes. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. As I slammed the last box shut, I took one last look around the house. The walls that once felt like a haven now seemed to pulse with darkness. The memories of the woman haunted me, her warning lingering in the air. I stepped outside into the night, the cool breeze brushing against my skin. Months passed since I left that cursed house. I settled into a new place, trying to rebuild my life. But the whispers never left me. They echoed in the quiet moments, a reminder of the horror I had faced. Occasionally, I'd find myself glancing at the shadows in my new home, half expecting to see her there. I learned to ignore the anxiety, to push it away, but it never truly faded. Sometimes in the dead of night, when the world was quiet, I could still hear the faintest scratching sound, a reminder that she was never really gone. Epilogue. I often wonder what really happened in that attic, what secrets the woman held, and what darkness lurked within those walls. And though I tried to forget, a part of me knows I will never escape her whispers. The truth is, I still hear them on the coldest nights, a chilling reminder of the terror that almost consumed me.